Functions are an integral part of what JavaScript is and what JavaScript is capable of. So in this lesson, we're going to be covering what functions are and how they work. So what functions do is they allow us to execute a block of code. So we can set up a function, give it a name. So I'm just going to call it myFun1. And whenever we want to run this block of code, then we just reference the myFun1, the function name. So it will run this current block of code, and we'll just put a couple of console logs there so that we have some code to run within the myFun1 function. So now let's invoke the function myFun1, and the function is invoked with the rounded brackets. And then that's all you have to do to invoke the function, and you can run the same block of code multiple times. So let's try this out, and I'll just go over into the console, and you can see that that block of code was run multiple times. So we've got running test, running test, running test, running test, as we've ran the code 4 times since we're invoking the function 4 times. So the function is a keyword followed by the name of the function, followed by the parentheses, so those rounded brackets there. And function names can contain letters, digits, underscores, and dollar signs. So the same format as we see with variables. So you can start it out with an underscore, you can start it out with a dollar sign, and you can't start it with a number. And we see that the Visual Studio sends that number as a white character because this is invalid format. We can, however, have numbers within you can't have it starting with a number, but you can have it contained within the function name. We can also send in multiple parameters into the function, and these can be separated out by commas. So we can have a parameter A, B, and C, and then we can pick up the values of those parameters into the code that's being executed. So let's say, for instance, we've got the myFun1, and we're going to send 5, 10, and 15 in to match with those values. So we're going to be outputting A, B, and C. And let's see what happens. So go back into the console, and we see that we're outputting those parameters that were passed in. So once they come into the function, they're arguments, and the values that are received by the function as the function is being invoked, and then they can be used within the function. So let's say, for instance, we want it to output a value of A times B and have that output within the console message. We can use those parameters that were sent in and execute some code, make some calculations on those parameters. And that provides us more flexibility. So now, for instance, if we have another set of numbers that we're sending into the same function, we can have a different output result that is going to be seen within the console because, of course, the arguments that we passed into that function were different. There's also the function return, and the function return statement allows us to return a value, and this will also stop the execution of the function. So if we do return here, and that's just before the console message, we return the function, it's not going to continue to execute the content, that block of code, and whenever it hits the return, it will return the function and stop the execution of the code. And another thing we can do with return is that we can return back values. So we can do an A times B times C, and we can return that back to the statement that invoked the function. And so now, instead of having just the console messages, it's actually going to be returning a value, and we can capture that returned value within a variable if we want. And then using the console log, let's output val1 and val2 into the console so we can take a look at what values got returned. So this time, what's happening here is that val1 is being assigned whatever the return value of fun1 is, and fun1 is expecting several different arguments. So we're passing them in as 5, 10, and 15. That's corresponding with A, B, and C. Within the console, we're outputting A, B, and C, so whatever was passed in. And then we're returning back A times B times C. So the return back value is going to be what gets assigned to val1. And then the same thing for val2 is it's going to run through the function, run through all of that block of code, sending in those arguments. So we get a return back value of 750 and 10,500. So the 750 is 5 times 10, which is 50, times 15, which is 750. And I'm not even going to try to do the 15 times 20 times 35, but I think you get the point there that we can run the function, return back values, and then use those values within the code. And we can also reuse functions as many times as necessary, assigning values to those variables. So there's also different scopes for function. So when it comes to scope, that block of code with the curly brackets is the scope that the block of code is running within. And if we have a reference to a variable that is defined or not defined within that block of code, then that's going to be output. So let's say, for instance, we set D to a value of 10, and we do a return A times B times C times D. It's going to look for a value of D in the local scope, which is within the curly brackets. If it doesn't find that within that local scope, it'll go over to the parent scope, and then that's where it will draw the value of D as 10. So let's take a look at that. And what that did is that simply multiplied us by 10. We can also use D within the local scope. So we can set a value of D, and this is going to be within the local scope. So let's set it to 1000. And now this reference to D is not going to be the global scope D of 10. It's going to be whatever the local scope of D is, which is 1000. So let's refresh it, and we can see that now we're referencing that local scope value of 1000 because we've got that value in the function. And this, at that point as well, is not referencing the same D because we do have it on the local scope. So if I was to take the global scope D out and we were looking for a value of D after we've run the function, we're not going to have a value of D on this scope, on the parent scope, because the way that the scope works is it only looks within itself, or it looks to the parent. And because this block of code is not within the current block of code we're referencing D, we're going to throw an error. So let's try that and see what happens. So we get D is not defined, because of course we never defined D, but we were trying to use it within the statement there where we're logging out the value of D. So try it out, pass in some arguments into a function and run a function several different times. Also returning back the value of the function using the return keyword, and then outputting those values into the console. And you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson.